So I'll start the second part of the lecture, which I said is on the essay on the critique of violence, 1921. And here are two lines from this essay, which are very famous and may stand as were the epigraph of this lecture. Some of you may recognize that the second is perhaps the starting point of Arendt study of mere life. This is the point where he gets the idea of mere life from. It's a very early essay. He was 29 years old, something like that, when he wrote this. It's really remarkable. And I hope through this reading of this essay to be able to show a confluence of ideas. Again, these ideas, and I tried to very quickly indicate some clusters of ideas. There's another great similarity with Bakhtin, the way in which the same thing is repeatedly iterated by Banerjee. Also the fragmentary character of both of their thinking. Bakhtin always dreamt also of writing fully, and there is this great passion, this earnestness in Bakhtin, which is very different from Banerjee's. But so the essay. It's an essay which has received a great deal of attention in recent times. A number of modern interpretations and treatments are available. It appeared for the first time in 1921 in the 47th issue of a journal edited by a well-known German intellectual called Emil Lederer, the Archiv für Sozialwissenschaft und Sozialpolitik. Lederer considered it for a more popular journal which had better circulation, but thought it was too difficult, and therefore relegated it to this more weighty journal which had a smaller readership. But the interesting thing is that another major contributor to this journal was Carl Schmitt. Carl Schmitt had, by then, I think, in the same year, 1921, he writes his book on the dictator. Subsequently, he writes political theology. Political theology may be, in fact, a kind of take up. Some people think of the response to Benjamin, but it may not be a response as much as both in Benjamin and in Schmitt there is a kind of angular relationship. It's not very direct. But we'll also talk about that later. Now, one of the studies which I find very useful and very illuminating is the reading by Giorgio Agamben. Somebody asked me this question in the book The State of Exception, where the fourth chapter is entitled Gigantomachy about the Void, which is really a study of the dialogue between Benjamin and Schmitt over the question of violence and the question of the exception. Now, it's in the course of this study that Agamben says that if you look at the connections between Benjamin and Schmitt, Schmitt, as you all know, was a great, later surfaced as a great supporter of the Nazi party. He is seen as being the legitimizer of the concentration camp. His reputation is mud, to say the least. And in 1955, when this knowledge of this connection became apparent, I think even later, the editors of the early editors of Critique of Violence simply suppress these facts. But this is there, and Agamben is very anxious to find out the exact nature of their relationship. And in this connection, he makes this distinction between the exoteric dossier and the esoteric dossier. The exoteric dossier are the historical
traces of the relationship, which are not very large. Some comments here and there. There is a reference to Benjamin in Hamlet and Hecuba. There are letters written to each. Benjamin sent his essay for comments to Schmitt. And there is very interesting, the third curriculum vitae that he wrote, sometime in 23 or something like that, which mentions very neutrally his conversation with Schmitt. So that's more or less what the exoteric dossier contains. The esoteric dossier, which is the secret history of their relationship, is more extensive, says Arendt, because there is a constant, inner, unstated, unacknowledged dialogue between the two. A dialogue which Agamben and I, that is the reading that I have adopted, is sees as being deeply, what should I say, conflicting, deeply oppositional. That is how I will try to read this. So the essay, Critique of Violence, or perhaps translated better as On a Critique of Violence, the essay is published titled Zur Kritik der Gewalt, written during late 1920 or 1921. The word Gewalt can also mean force or might or power. And the other side, I mean, both terms are, Gewalt itself is a term which is shifting in meaning. On the other hand, critique. Critique is really related to that business about decomposition that I was talking about. It's not a critique in that you write a commentary, but it's a critique that you try to excavate the problem, try to take it out. And this is what he says in the essay, Benjamin writes in the essay on Goethe's elective affinities, which is written shortly after the critique, which is the business of critique is the excavation of the ideal of the problem. The excavation of the ideal comes only when this act of decomposition is complete. Because then the idea stands, as it were, denuded of all surrounding everything else. It stands in itself, by itself, and can be seen then. And this is what Benjamin attempts in this essay called Zur Kritik der Gewalt. Now the background, again, as you will realize, is the Weimar Republic came into power after 1918. Kaiser Friedrich flees, power is taken over by the formation of the Republic. Repeated problems happening, lots of strikes, lots of political unrest. So a series of strikes, one is the sailors' strike, when they were, after the war, during the war, they were constantly denied money, they were thrust into the dangerous areas, and so this is a period which is contested and difficult in terms of labor history and the history of strikes. So this is something which one has to bear in mind, and also a general, if there is, there are questions which are being raised and partly articulated about the nature of parliamentary democracy and even the limitations of parliamentary democracy this time. And one interesting connection which is stated in the essay itself is Benjamin's acute reading of the writings of a French theorist and political theorist called Georges Sorel. Sorel wrote a book called Reflections of Violence, published in 1915, which Benjamin cites several times. Sorel was something of an anarchist. He was also a syndicalist. It refers to the syndicats, the great trade unions which the 19th century one sees in France. Sorel is deeply anti-bourgeois, pro-working class, asking for a violent, supporting in many cases, use of violence in revolutionary activity. So the first, I think, issue is something which might be expressed as the first point about the critique is that it is also a reflection on two things, on natural law and positive law. Natural law seeks to justify means, positive law seeks to guarantee ends. And it is a thesis of natural law. Oh, here's Schmitt, here's Arendt, and this is the comment that I'm reading. This thesis of natural law that regards violence as a natural datum is diametrically opposed to that of positive law, which sees violence as a product of history. If natural law can judge all existing law in criticizing its ends, so positive law can judge all evolving law only in criticizing its means. And justice is the criterion of ends, legality is that of means. You understand this? I think it's quite clear that if you think of the end of law, you might think that the end of law is justice. If you think of the means of law, the law must pursue its end through legality. So here you come to this great fissure in the idea of law itself. Both, for Benjamin, are in the end unsatisfactory. But at least positive law distinguishes between sanctioned violence and unsanctioned violence. Natural law doesn't do that. Because it is the nature of law to make a distinction, the positive law, the founded law, the law code, the law which is enacted and is the basis of the structures of governance, to make a distinction or to subsist on the distinction between sanctioned violence and unsanctioned violence. And Benjamin is much more skeptical about the distinction in natural law between violence used for just ends and violence used for unjust ends, because that is for him a far more tenuous and a far more contested relationship. My friend Rajiv Patke draws attention to a passage in George Sorel which powerfully distinguishes between violence and force, the latter a regulatory prerogative of the ruling class, the former, so force, is what the ruling class possesses. The former properly, that is violence, properly belonging to the act of revolt. The term violence should be employed only for acts of revolt. We should say, therefore, that the object of force is to impose a certain social order in which the minority governs, while violence tends to the destruction of that order. The middle class have used force in the beginning of modern times. The proletariat now reacts against the middle class and against the state by violence, which is what I was trying to say earlier about Sorel. This is T. E. Hume's translation, incidentally, 1915. This brings me to the second major point in Benjamin's essay that I would like to consider. Benjamin thinks about the need of the legal system to regulate and limit all areas where individual ends could be usefully pursued by violence. As a result, he directs legal boundaries for those areas in which natural ends are admitted as a matter of principle in a general way. The example that he gives is of education, returning back to Benjamin's engagement with educational policy, which occupied him. about 5 years ago, 5 or 6 years ago, he was deeply, continually writing a number of essays on this subject. So the example that he gives, that if natural ends are pursued with excessive violence, they become subject to legal restrictions and penalties. So there are the laws relating to limits of educational authority to punish, which you might say is a continuing area. And what you might think is surprising is the unresolved character of these issues. And the unresolved character of the basic issue is that what are the limits of authority to pursue its ends through violence? So he formulates, Benjamin formulates a general principle that in all present-day European legislation, the natural ends of individuals must collide with legal ends if they are pursued with violence. The law regards violence in the hands of individuals as a danger undermining the legal system. Just other areas which you might think here is the right of self-defense, the right of protection of property, the right of control over children. I find that the Pope has today spoken, it isn't the bulla, but still he has spoken, and the Pope is infallible, that children may be mildly chastised. Which is of course a very good thing, I think. The conclusion that he draws and sees as shocking is that the interest of the law in maintaining its exclusive right over violence has little to do with the preservation of legal ends, but far more with the preserving of the law itself. Violence, when not in the hands of the law, threatens it not by the ends it might pursue, but by its mere existence outside the law. A chance example that he considers may have fundamental consequences for the aesthetic representation of violence, as for instance for well-known examples of tragedy. That is the example of the great criminal. How often the great criminal, however repellent his ends may have been, has aroused the secret admiration of the public. I'm thinking of tragedy because my training is in literature. I'm thinking of a play like Macbeth, for instance, where the entire question of aesthetic response, or the entire body of Jacobean drama, where the distinction between that which is extra-legal, and the sanction of violence, the entire discourse of revenge, these are issues which you might think of in this connection. This, Benjamin argues, cannot stem from the dead, which is repugnant to all, but by the violence to which it bears witness. Sorry, not from the deed. Can't read my own handwriting these days. This cannot result from the deed, but only from the violence to which it bears witness. In this case, therefore, the violence of which present-day law is seeking in all areas of activity to deprive the individual appears really threatening and arouses, even in defeat, the sympathy of the mass against law. So it's in this connection that Benjamin considers the relationship between violence and law in this very powerful, and I think that it's an instrument which we may use, and this is a great thing about Benjamin, because I think of the extremely aphoristic and pliable character of his ideas. They become tools for excavation. And that is really, I think, something that he anticipates in his writings. The distinction that is central to this essay between law-making violence and law-preserving violence. All violence as a means, he says, is either law-making or law-preserving. The first concerns the constitutive act of establishing the law, and you might think that that may come, to just broaden the context a little, through freedom struggle to military action for conquest. The second is embedded in state institutions. Law-making changes at the time of violent insurrections or transfers of power. A point that we were trying to pursue at a seminar which Kavita organized once was that what happened in 1947? That law-making changed, but law-preserving remained largely the same. The police, which were previously performing certain kinds of actions and prosecuting certain kinds of people, start now to prosecute different kinds of people. And it essentially remains the same, doesn't change. Thus, we come across or we encountered the problem of the inseparability of law from violence, the violent determination of what forms of violence are justifiable for what kinds of ends. The power which is established by law-making violence places the lawbreaker under the threat of law-preserving violence. For law-preserving violence is a threatening violence, is always the threat. That if you perform such and such, it's always mandatory, it's always prescriptive. This cannot be done. That is also something to do with the Christian response to the Judaic law. That is also something, I think, in Benjamin's mind somewhere. The law is something which is threatening. If this be done, then something happens. Okay. However, this brings us to the question of fate, as the law can operate only if the lawbreaker is apprehended. And here he is a discussion of capital punishment. All violence for, The debate on capital punishment brings out for Benjamin maximally the problem of this conflict or this problem. The critical nature of the problem is thus brought out into the open. The attack on capital punishment attacks the basis of the law itself, its very origin. For if violence crowned by fate, is the origin of law, then it may be readily supposed that where the highest violence, that over life and death, occurs in the legal system, the origins of law jut manifestly and fearsomely into existence. So it's there that we really see that originary point of lawmaking. It becomes evident at this. All violence, and that is what Benjamin, of course, you understand what he's after when he says that this is the rotten core of the law. The rotten core of the law. All violence, thus for Benjamin, is either law-making or law-preserving. And if it denies a claim to both of these predicates, it forfeits validity. However, the question that follows is crucial. Are there none other than violent means for regulating conflicting human interests? The answer which Benjamin gives is that there is none within the law. Because the legal contract for Benjamin is inherently the space of violence. For if it is not so, it loses its legal efficacy. However, that is not to say, in the space of what we might think of as civil society, non-violent means are not possible, at least, because he says that non-violent means are possible wherever a civilized outlook allows the use of unalloyed means of governance or government or agreement. Good. And it is here that very surprisingly, and again, my contention that in Benjamin, all these ideas are very strongly one relating to the other. My attempt to separate these different ideas actually founders, because they again are related in most complex and disturbing ways, is the question of language. So here in the discussion of language page, I'm looking at the text that I'm using here is the page numbers are to the text in Jeffcott and Demetz's Reflections. It's a translation. That is the one that I have circulated.
Page numbers?
This is page 289. The sphere, the language, page 289, where he's talking about civilized outlook. Just after that. Okay. Legal and illegal means are kind of all the same. Violent may be confronted with non-violent means as unalloyed means. Courtesy, sympathy, peaceableness, trust, and whatever else might be here mentioned are their subjective preconditions. And it is later in 289 that he speaks about that there is one area which is wholly inaccessible to violence, and that is language. That it makes clear that there is a sphere of human agreement that is non-violent to the extent that it is wholly inaccessible to language, to violence, the proper sphere of understanding language. Of late, and a peculiar process of decay has it been penetrated by legal violence in the penalty placed on fraud. However, I think that it is right to say that Benjamin denies the state as a legal entity or a law-making and law-preserving entity any relief to the consideration of the effective bonds or exchanges possible within the bounds of civility. The state can only establish and execute the law, and thus falls within what Benjamin hints at this, and Agamben makes this into an important critical instrument, a zone of indistinction. Capital punishment preserves law and establishes a new one. The police, continually preserving the legal code and its infringements, can, for security reasons, intervene where no pre-established legal procedure exists, thus creating new laws. And this is really the idea on which so much of Agamben's writing is founded. The way in which he sees that this kind of understanding of law, especially law which underwrites the structure of Western democracy, opens up these spaces where certain kinds of unprecedented activity become possible. simply because of the fact that there is, as it were, a space which lies between something which is permissible and something which is not permissible, an area that is indistinct. And it is this zone of indistinction that is constantly coming up, as it were, into view. A critic, Husserl Larsen, observes, in capital punishment and police violence alike, the state reaffirms itself. Law is an immediate manifestation of violence or force, and the end of the law is the law itself. In subsequent section of this essay, and again it's possible for reasons of time to go through all its points, not even one, thought of doing three. Is Benjamin turns to a distinction between mythic violence and divine violence, which occupy me to the end of this talk, very much left. Now, this mythic violence is derived from the story of Niobe, who had 14 children, and Leto, who had 2. That's the story that he refers to. Apollo and Artemis, and Niobe is proud of having 14 children, and Apollo and Artemis destroy all her children, and Niobe, grieving, turns into a crying stone, a statue, which is the physical embodiment of the law. The statue is also the statute, instituting a boundary stone on the frontier between the men and the gods. And it is here that in this discussion of mythic violence that Benjamin makes one other great move in this essay of establishing that power is the principle of all lawmaking. If mythic violence, as exemplified in the Niobe story, is an allegory of the lawmaking and the law-preserving power of the state, racked and ridden with guilt that fate pronounces on the individual, in primitive societies, Benjamin says, where laws are unwritten and frontiers unmarked, nevertheless it is law which is operative and singles out even the unwitting offender for the direst punishment. However unluckily it may befall the unsuspecting victim, its occurrence is the understanding of law, not chance, but fate showing itself once again in its deliberate ambiguity. Page 296. Now this is something which is, of course, borne out very profoundly by Greek tragedy. Because continually in Greek tragedy, the action of fate is not something which can be thought of as having a precedent. That's Benjamin's point about there being no boundary, no frontier which is marked. Nevertheless, and that is one of the great fables of this, of course, is Antigone. Antigone, who, in the end, it is fate which pronounces that Antigone is justified and Creon is not justified. But there is no there is no guide up to then. There is nothing which can predict such an action of fate. There is only the activity of the soothsayer. The soothsayer who is always mistrusted, but who is always correct. That is, the curse of Tiresias is the whole, the problem of predictability. Yeah, that is, I think, interesting. Because, as we know, I mean, there's this great literature on the subject, that Antigone pursues a certain, or bases her action upon a certain set of principles which she articulates, and Creon on another. Now, who is to say, while this is going on, that Creon is better or Antigone is better? The problem is that it is fate who reveals which is better, decisively, unambiguously, finally, but does not assign a reason. There are no reasons assigned for the action of fate. So, however unluckily it may befall, however unluckily it may befall its unsuspecting victim, its occurrence is, in the understanding of the law, not chance but fate showing itself once again in its deliberate ambiguity. And he refers, this is a book that he refers to several times, Hermann Cohen's book, where he says that the ancient conception of fate is an inescapable realization that it is fate's orders themselves that seem to cause and bring about this infringement, this offense. Fate both causes and condemns the offense. To the spirit of law, even the modern principle that ignorance for law is not protection against punishment testifies. Just as the struggle of a written law in the early period of the ancient Greek communities is to be understood as a rebellion against the spirit of mythical statutes. This is something that is very, very profound. Because this is foundational, for instance, in modern studies, a very seminal modern study of ancient Greek culture, Jean-Pierre Vernon's book called The Origin of Greek Thought, where he's essentially making this point, that the first demand of the state, the first demand of the creation of the political community, the Greek polis, is the writing down of the law. That which is secret, that which is sacred, must now be committed. It is not retrospective. Something is committed and then the law comes unavoidably. It may come from a human source or it comes from a divine source. It is the same. It comes. It is unavoidable and it is recognized as being divine. To say it is recognized as being unconditionally true or correct and unimpeachable. So coming near to the end of this very difficult essay of mine, at least the points that I would like to. In the final swerve of this troubled and obscure essay, Benjamin engages finally with the question of law and justice. Justice in this apocalyptic vision is wholly divine and amounts neither to lawmaking nor law preserving, but law destroying. It is thus contrasted with the hegemonic desire of the state, for it is never reason that decides on the justification of means and the justness of ends. Fate-imposed violence decides on the former and God on the latter. Now I feel, and perhaps I'm jumping steps, but I feel that there is something here between what you might call the discursive character of the law and, as it were, the fragmentariness by which we can, and that is a condition of our understanding of the divine. Our understanding of the divine must necessarily always be fragmentary. And that is, I think, also something where Benjamin makes a distinction between the mythic and the allegorical. The allegorical is that which is revealed when history has been stripped away, everything else has withered away. What remains is that allegorical ruin, which is what is Benjamin calls its physiognomy. And it is here that Benjamin makes this really surprising claim. Just as in all spheres God opposes myth, mythical violence is confronted with the divine. Mythical violence is lawmaking, even in a sense that is sporadic and non-continuous. It makes the law and acts upon it, destroys people. It enacts. It's the form of exacting justice. Divine violence is law destroying if the former erects boundaries between men and gods and in fate. The latter boundlessly destroys them. Divine violence is thus viewed by Benjamin as expiatory, through which God's judgment alights without warning or precedent on some for the sake of others. It is exemplified in the story that he takes from the book of Numbers in the Bible, chapter 16, verses 1 to 40, which is the story of the destruction of Korah and the Levites, who resisted the leadership of Moses and were as a result swallowed up by the state. This is that instance which Benjamin says stands outside the law. Because in some sense even mythic violence is the image for the violence which is violence of the state. It is mythic violence which ultimately becomes, through its codification, from the transition from the lex dicta to the lex scripta, it becomes the written law. But the divine violence is here. The solution of legal violence shows from the guilt of more natural life, which consigns the dissolution of legal violence shows from the guilt of a more natural life, which consigns the living, innocent and unhappy, to a retribution that expiates the guilt of mere life, and doubtless also purifies the guilty, not of guilt, however, but of the law. For with mere life the rule of law over the living ceases. Mythical violence is bloody power over mere life for its own sake. Divine violence, pure power over all life for the sake of the living. The first demands sacrifice, the second accepts it. Those of you who are familiar with the second section of Agamben's Homo Sacer will recognize the distinction that a further move that Agamben makes between that which may be sacrificed and that which may be killed but not sacrificed. What Benjamin seems to emphasize is not the miraculousness of the divine intervention, but the expiating moment in them that strikes without bloodshed. The story of Korah, that's swallowed up in the earth and they are gone forever. I mean, you don't see them, they don't. And the manner it stands outside the law, whereas mythic violence conflates means and ends, says Benjamin. Divine violence separates means and ends. Well, the story of the destruction of Korah has by many modern scholars been read as an example of Benjamin's Judaic messianism. And it's seen that at the end, Benjamin is is dissolving political categories into something like a metaphysical or eschatological category, where God acts with divine action, of course, is something which stands apart from political history and can only relate to political history in the act of destruction of political history. There's no other way in which they understood. But it is, I think, possible that what Benjamin is saying has a more immediate political relevance in the context of the problems that the essay raises. Simply, we might say that the mythic violence represented by the state is contaminated with blood rotten at the core. And this is contrasted with the revolutionary possibility of the destruction of the law altogether and the foundation of a new historical epoch. This is, if you like, a kind of optimistic reading of this essay, trying to read it in terms of what I take to be the larger context of Benjamin's writing. Benjamin in 1921 knew very little about Marx, but he had read a fair amount of Sorel. He had read other Marxist and socialist thinkers, so it's not that he was aware of these ideas, but I think that this is very peculiarly an idea that Benjamin sees, that the law as it exists within society is necessarily contaminated by the ends to which it is put and the means by which such ends are served. So what he's thinking of is that moment of annihilation from which a new possibility can be born. That then is the fissure. That is the fissure through which the Messiah enters. That is. Just allow me a minute to find the passage. Give me a minute to find it. The way he's talking about it's the second is the other edition. Sorry. All this is because we will finish in a minute. Yes. For every second of time was the straight gate through which the Messiah might enter. Want to get actually. This is the second addition to the thesis. So many readers of the essay have been critical of this last swerve, seeing in it a Messiano-Marxist or archaeo-eschatological stance, too mired in notions of prophecy and salvation to serve as practical political philosophy. Messianico-Marxist and archaeo-eschatological are both terms applied by Jacques Derrida. Dr. Amlan, whom I think of as Benjamin's most steadfast reader in modern political philosophy, however, sees at the end of Critique of Violence a tantalizing hint that Thatcher's once but strongly enough to illuminate the whole argument. The Critique of Violence, Agamben writes, does not evaluate violence in relation to the ends that it pursues as a means, but seeks its criterion in a distinction within the sphere of the means itself, without regard for the ends that they serve. Agamben thus excavates Benjamin's insight that violence can be a pure medium, that is, the figure of a paradoxical mediality without ends. The question that arises is equally potent in primitive Christianity, which is Agamben's field of study, one of his fields of studies, and the book that I am particularly referring to is his study of Paul's epistles called The Time That Remains. He's talking about Paul's announcement of the Messianic. What happens to the law after Messianic fulfillment? That is the critical question that arises from Benjamin, I think, in this essay, through Agamben's intervention. What happens to the law after the establishment of classless society? And Agamben points the decisive document, which he calls in the Benjamin Schmitt dossier, come back to that, is certainly the 8th thesis on the concept of history composed by Benjamin a few months before his death. Here we read that the tradition of the oppressed teaches us the state of exception in which we live is the rule. We must attain to a concept of history that accords with this fact. Then we will clearly see that it is our task to bring about the real state of exception, and this will improve our position in the struggle against fascism. Therefore, the way in which, and conclude with this, it's amazingly timed, it's here that I think that the real point, I mean, this be tenable, and I think it is, it's for you to judge. Schmitt's exception necessary to protect, Schmitt's idea of the exception is necessary to protect existing legal order. The regime of lawlessness becomes legal. Benjamin seeks to pass beyond the law to speak about the possibility of bringing oppression to an end. Thank you. Stop here. I'm very happy to answer whatever questions I can, though I cannot promise to answer any questions at all. I've read a number of biographies and whatever to lay my hands on, please looked at them. So the two biographies particularly, which I found very useful, one is of course the one that I referred to, is the Ireland and Jennings 2014, which is very, very detailed, very meticulously done. And also slightly earlier, about 10 years ago, Uwe Steiner, That's another book. It's well worth considering. It's in German. It's translated into English. Thank you.
If anybody has questions, so please.
I have two questions. One question is, you have referred to this, all of us know this Benjamin Adorno relationship, rather complex. Now, on the basis of this Adorno-Benjamin correspondence, which is available between them, now, how far is it correct to say, this has been our standard common sense understanding, that on question of music, while Adorno's position was rather conservative, Benjamin's position was much more non-conventional and open. And broadly speaking, Adorno's position, well, he was not very open on many topics. Yes. And also on the question of technology, perhaps Adorno's position was rather conservative. This is my first question. My second question is that when you are talking of this 1921 essay on this question of violence, now by that time the German Revolution had already taken place, or it was an abortive thing. Now, from Benjamin's writings, is any clue available? That is, what was Benjamin's perception of German Revolution? Did he have any relation with the German Communist Party? Because thereafter actually he travelled to Moscow, writes a Moscow diary. So, yes.
If I take both questions at one. First, about technology and his relationship with Adorno. I think that in the case of music, Benjamin does not show himself to be tremendously either knowledgeable or interested in music. That's specifically with regard to music. He's interested more particularly in forms of popular culture, and it's really the film, because of its flickering discontinuity, which then constitutes, frame by frame, constitutes a whole, which gives him that kind of angle which he requires to bring that into a kind of powerfully subsume that into a kind of thinking which he's trying to do. But regarding the additional question that you made, that do you think Adorno was more conservative? I think that he was, because Adorno at some point of time is more doctrinaire. That's principally, I think, the reason why. Because he's trying to fit this treatment of technology and into a certain kind of analysis of class and analysis of the function of the state apparatus. And I think that is the place where Benjamin, because he's entirely regardless of these things, and Benjamin finds great pleasure also in some kind. Benjamin is also habitually subversive, I think, because he is, after all, a loose cannon. He doesn't have a position to defend or anything like that. He's quite capable of doing that. It's a very common sense answer, so I can't take it in a more scholarly manner. But the second point, well, he's continually referring to the difference between the political strike, which is the strike of the general strike, which is the strike of the middle class. Which I think is a very, very Sorelian point. That is the something which it's in a very weird way, it is analogous to the distinction between feast and carnival that Bakhtin makes. The feast is something which the church itself sanctions, a space of freedom sanctioned by the church, therefore policed and controlled by the church. It's the carnival which turns this against the church, and therefore it's the proletarian general strike that he talks about in 1921, is which he sees as having a revolutionary potential. Regarding connection with the Communist Party, his brother had a long connection with the Communist Party already. He's grounding in in Berlin at this time. He undoubtedly knew most of these people, but his formal reading of Marx and his interest in Marxist theory starts only after 1924. Yes, sir, please.
Sorry, for
Listen for the recordings.
just one more thing which follows from what you are saying. Then can one say that so far as this culture, broadly speaking, is concerned, music very specifically, Adorno was much more concerned with the content of music. Say for his writings on Beethoven, for example.
Yes, yes.
So he is very much concerned with the content, spirit of music, whereas Benjamin is much more concerned with the experimenting with forms
Yes.
and techniques. Can one say
In that respect, I think that he would be closer to Krakauer. And Krakauer's idea, Shukriyadi was pointing this outside, he had this very close relationship with Krakauer and Krakauer's idea of the mass ornament, the idea of discontinuity in Krakauer. And I think that that is something which is being studied separately, but I'm not very familiar with the literature there, but I would generally accept your point as being generally valid, that Benjamin is interested in the possibility of these forms themselves being broken, and the more that they can be broken, the better off we are, because content must be liberated from form. And this, the way in which these things. And that is one of the reasons why I don't find any kind of sustained reflection upon German classical music in him. He listens to it off and on. There's some references to Wagner and to writing on Wagner, which of course through Nietzsche he has some idea of these things. But in a general way, I don't find it so.
That is not a very sustained.
It's not a very sustained, they are fragmentary again, and it passes. It's not very. It's also not very deep. I mean, to be very frank, sir, it's not very deep.
As is in the case of Adorno.
Adorno is very powerful, and whatever you may say about Adorno is a figure who must be met, as it were, and must contain Adorno. Adorno is a very powerful thinker. His kind of analysis is very, very powerful, I would say. Yeah. Yes, please. Do sit, please.
Actually, I just wanted to just understand one thing, that you said that there's a relation between language violence, non-violence and language. Can you just explain that once more? I really couldn't understand.
Yeah. He's saying that language is uncontaminated by violence, but he feels that in recent times, sort of this is a kind of gloomy comment on his times, that it has become contaminated because of the law about fraud. Now, let me just get this passage out for you once again. Let's just go over this. It's 289, I think, yeah. 289. Yes. Let me read the whole passage. The sphere of nonviolent means opens up the realm of human conflicts relating to goods. For this reason, technique in the broadest sense of the world is their most particular area. The profoundest example is perhaps the conference, considered as a technique of civil agreement. For in it, not only is a non-violent agreement possible, but that's to say, even if you think of a political conference where people meet and discuss and agree for certain steps to be taken, and so on. But the exclusion of violence, in principle, is quite explicitly demonstrable by one significant factor, that there is no sanction for lying there. And whatever is said, that the law cannot be a lie. The law is true, even when the law is not followed. This is, I think, what he's trying to say, is that the law is thus uncontaminated by fraud. So what he goes on to say, The exclusion of violence in principle is quite explicitly demonstrable once. Probably no legislation on earth originally stipulated such a sanction. It makes clear that it is a sphere of human agreement that is non-violent to the extent that it is wholly inaccessible to violence, that is the proper sphere of understanding language. Understanding language.
That means that law, the language of law cannot be violent.
No, not. He's not wholly saying that. What he's saying is that the law and the way that I understand things, the way that you ask me a question and I understand it, that cannot be contaminated by violence. That is.
Amlan, these two concepts of mythic violence and divine violence, and mythic violence as being largely identical to legal violence, and divine violence being more of pure violence. Now, Benjamin is possibly writing, as you're saying, with the socialist revolution in mind. But isn't this something which can be used by any, the fascist philosophy of Aryan, non-Aryan, would they also not be able to use the same kind of a division in the philosophy that they were using? Or is there anything in his writings which speaks about this?
Well, first of all, he says that this is the instrument against fascism. That is our struggle against fascism. That is the oldest theory. He says in the eighth section. There we should clearly realize that it is our task of bringing about a real state of emergency, and this will improve our position in the struggle against fascism. And as much as fascism is state-sponsored violence, as long as the violence stems from what he conceives of as the free action of the people, which is an expression of desire for freedom, I think that he would say that that is the methodological condition which guarantees it. It is thus falling into, whatever is state-sponsored, whatever is taken up, as it were, as part of the policy of the state. And that is Agamben's point, that what is happening now in Western democracies is they're opening up spaces where the law is suspended. And so the entire discourse of legality, the entire discourse of human right is suspended in this space, which is a space which they create for violent exaction of revenge or whatever else, which cannot be exacted within that. That's a different point, actually. That's a kind of addendum to the point that you are making. But my point is that inasmuch as all forms of fascism, if that be a general term for a number of evil things, then because it is state-sponsored, it is always guilty of that guilt of mythic violence.
Insofar as he is speaking of being in and being through, so he is speaking of the importance of language. So what does it mean? What does it mean to say when he says that existence cannot be expressed in language? What's the meaning of that?
You cannot express that which we are in. You cannot express the condition that we are in. In that sense, we have no standpoint on that which forms our existence itself. So it can only be conceptually articulated, but we cannot talk about our existence, or it is not that we articulate our existence through language, inasmuch as existence itself is apprehended linguistically, or exists linguistically.
But we can make others to understand about our existence. Do you mean to say that beside verbal language, there is any other language?
He's aware of this. I think that he's aware of all kinds of language, and that is the reason why he's thinking about the language of men as being a falling away, a reduction of what he calls pure language in itself, or language by itself. So that is something which is very, I think, very important for Benjamin, that language in itself inheres in everything, and language, therefore, the universe is inhabited by language, and human acts of naming, therefore, are a reduction of that. And all therefore human languages reduce that general condition of linguisticity, which is the condition of coexistence.
He speaks of spiritual things. What does it mean by spiritual things?
He doesn't talk about, see, Benjamin's use of, even when he talks about God, he talks about the Messiah, he talks about things. I very much doubt whether he's thinking of any, even in the anytime after 1915, and he's ever thinking about God in any specifically Judaic sense. But you must also understand that Judaism is a very, very this-worldly religion. Judaism is not like Christianity. Judaism is does not have, traditional Judaism does not have a notion of an afterlife. Whatever happens, happens here. Whatever happens, happens. This judgments are exacted in this world, and that is all. Well, there is an idea of the outer darkness and things like that, but in a real sense, it is a religion of practice. So the question that you are asking is that, does his thinking about language manifest some kind of, is he trying to make some point about some form of religious experience? I think not. Even when he talks about God, even when he talks about the Adamic naming of things, this is the function of language. He says that the function of human language is to name. Function of other kinds of language, when you're talking about language of flags, of stars, of flowers, of anything else, are maybe different. The function of human language inherently and essentially is to name, and no other language, that's the language of birds, or language of monkeys, or language of tigers, or language of however you may think of it, does not name.
Yeah.
Benjamin talked about, in this essay, about he made a distinction between law making and law preserving violence, and you are also reading Benjamin through, on some occasions, through Arendt reading.
I am guilty of that, yes.
So when Arendt talked about the spectacular state violence in the context of state of exception, and in the case when the legal civil war takes place in insurrections and all that. So when Benjamin talked about the law preserving violence, that was also spectacular time. But I don't know that. So can you throw some light whether the Benjamin had in mind the spectacular violence of the state or routine violence of the state regarding that?
It's a very good question, sir. Yeah, see, there are two things here, and that corresponds to the distinction which Benjamin is trying to make and is taken over by Arendt. One is the routine, the one that you call the routine violence of the state, which is the violence required for law preservation. But there is a moment of spectacular, what you might say, it may be, it's very interesting that when it occurs, it may be bloody, it may cause great bloodshed, but when it is remembered, when it is memorialized, it becomes a moment of freedom, liberty, whatever else it may be. When the state comes into being, the birth of the state, so that moment of the birth of the state becomes the moment where law making inaugurates a new law. But the instruments of preservation, which is a very nice phrase, the routine violence of the state is really that function of law preservation which goes on largely unchanged. Because this is something that my parents I grew up mostly in the era before independence, and I once asked them that, do you see any real difference between the function of the police, for instance, before and after independence? They said, no, it's not the same. And that is what I would again concur with your description of routine violence in the state. What happens is that spectacular violence, which is the spectacularity of the establishment of a new order, creates something which is radically different in that yesterday's internee becomes today's minister. And so at any point when such a insurrection takes place, or revolution takes place, or transfer of power takes place, or even when some kind of election takes place, when some entrenched power is removed, such a ceremonial may be invented about it. Such a spectacularity may be given to it, both then and retrospectively.
Just wanted to go back to the Krauschspiel, his Krauschspiel book, his German tragic drama book, and I was wondering, it's to get a fix on what the form exactly is about, because there's very little discussion of the Krauschspiel plays. I mean, after a point he moves to talking about Hamlet, and you also talked about how Jacobean plays have been looked at in a similar manner. And the book, I think, contains the seed of a lot of what he sort of unpacks over the years, including his idea of the philosophy of history. But except in sort of an analogy, there's very little idea of what these plays were speaking to, or what it's about. So if you could.
Well, let me assure you first of all that these plays themselves are rather tedious. I mean, they are tedious in the sense that they are formulaic, and they are the product of certain kind of culture of excess. That's the one point. It is because they are excess and they are ritualistic that Benjamin sees the break from mythic, which is tragic violence. It is not tragic. It does not anymore observe. Now what has happened is that there is that general air of mourning, a general air of sadness, a general air of despondency, which is our response to the spectacle of the ruin. That's one thing that I would say is important here. Now, the idea of this, doesn't use the word exception. He uses the idea, one, of sovereign power, because all that these examples that he's taking, and that is something which is really very interesting about the great flowering of drama in the European Renaissance and subsequently right up to the 18th century, is the fact that they are constantly holding up to us paradigms of sovereign power. And sovereign power in tragedy always, in some sense, fragmented, broken, imperfect, and that is what makes this, from Kid and Marlowe, right up to beyond Corneille, right into Restoration tragedy, and till its demise in the 18th century, more or less, as the form, demise of the form is irrelevant. I would say that this, because nearly all tragedy this time is written about, I mean, small proportion is about ordinary middle class domestic tragedy and things like that. The large bulk of it is tragedy of the court. Now, one important consequence of this is that inasmuch as the court is being imagined, it necessarily has consequences for the way it speaks about state as a whole. So in some sense, it is a repeated articulation of the problems of imagining a political community. In these partial, broken forms. Now, the point particularly that I would like to focus on what you find in German tragic drama, two things. One is the state of exception, the state of emergency. The idea of the state of emergency and the idea of sovereign power. The sovereign power is constantly in a state where something disastrous has happened, and that is what is referred to as the catastrophe. It is always the moment of catastrophe. There is no other moment which is relevant. This kind of play, says Benjamin, whether rightly or wrongly, and I've read a bit of Gryphius, and tried to, not been successful, but I've read a fair amount of Dryden, tragedies. You recommended to us in college when we were law-abiding. Sir will remember those days in Presidency College. The teachers told us what to do and we did it. We didn't know why we were doing it. We did it. We were so scared of them. But this is the point then, that the state of emergency, and there are usually these contrasting types of the virtuous ruler and the villain, who is created. So what you are getting is not in any sense a paradigm society, but certain entirely typical situations which are repeated, formulae which are repeated, but all founded upon the general idea of the catastrophe, the omnipresence of death, destruction and violence, and thus the sense of not even of commemoration, but of mourning. I think this is what he gets out of these plays, and this is what he feeds into. He refers to Gryphius, there are some other playwrights that he talks about, but as rightly pointed out, there is not very much that he has to say about them. As I was saying, that what really this affords us, why my question was, what I tried to understand when I was first time I came to this, I knew a little bit about what Benjamin had done before. So why did he write this thesis? Why didn't he write something on criticism? Why didn't he write something on Kant? Why didn't he was so well read in German philosophy? Why did he break everything and go off to this? That is, I think, the point, because this notion of allegory was a necessary extension of the kind of study that he was doing before, of the concept of criticism. I think this is my answer to your questions.